framework to about $6 to $8 a gigajoule now. So things have improved, no doubt about that.
What is a reasonable price?
Well,
what is the reasonable price you're aiming at, and can the government intervene to get a reasonable price?
The first question you asked, what's a reasonable price? Well, a reasonable price is something that is parity or close to what the gas could sell for overseas, and that's how most of our markets work. That we export 90% of our coal, but we don't have a shortage of coal because there's a proper market and enough coal stays here for us to use for power production and steel production where we still have it. And likewise, the gas price should reflect what is the market price overseas. Now, it wasn't doing that a few months ago for a range of reasons, which you probably will pull me up before I get too far into it, but it is closer to doing that now. Should we regulate price? The problem with that is governments get it wrong. I don't trust Richard or myself or Amanda to get the price right. And if we get the price wrong, we won't just have shortage of gas.
I don't trust big coal and gas.
Yeah, you guys don't trust any businesses, but I think if we regulate the price, you'll end up with a level where quite often you'll have too low a price to encourage the investment, and then we'll get a real shortage.
Okay, let's go to Amanda Rishworth. What's Labor's position on this?
Well, look, we do think that there is an issue with both supply and price when it comes to gas, and we've got to remember that gas is not just for energy. It is actually an input in the manufacturing process, bricks, fertiliser. So it's actually important not just for energy but for manufacturing as well. So does government have a role? Yes, Labor thinks government has a role.
Does Labor think government has a role in regulating the price of gas so that it's reasonable and affordable for ordinary Australians?
Our position at the moment is that the government has a mechanism at its fingertips, and that is to trigger domestic supply and ensure that export gas is diverted for domestic use. Now, that in itself will push down prices, but
it might not.
Well, look,
what's the guarantee that it'll push down prices?
If you are filling the domestic market and ensuring that there's enough for domestic supply, that is going to push down prices. That is a mechanism. And why the government won't do it, I don't understand, because it's a simple mechanism. It's a mechanism that's in place. In addition to that, we have asked the government...
You're talking about the domestic gas security mechanism?
Yes, that's correct. That's correct. And it is time for the government to say, we are actually going to put the framework in place to limit the amount that goes offshore to actually ensure that the domestic market is filled with...
Let's quickly get Matt to answer that. Why didn't you do that?
Well, because a few weeks ago, the gas companies have signed an agreement with the government to supply the gas that AEMO, that's the energy regulator, the energy market operator, identified as shortages here in Australia. So look, we're interested in the outcomes, obviously, Tony. The mechanism has no doubt that the threat of the regulation has clearly helped bring those companies to the table.
But would the actual use of the mechanism, the regulation, keep prices lower?
Well, no, because the mechanism would only bring back that amount of gas that the companies have already agreed to bring back. Now, of course, if the companies don't meet their side of the bargain, they've signed an agreement with us, of course, we'll be able to look again at it. But clearly, it's better in these situations to work things out on a voluntary basis, and that's what's happened, although with some, I think, cajoling from the government, and rightly so, given the circumstances we're in.
Michele, what do you think the Australian public is making of this? Because all they see is gas prices and electricity prices skyrocketing.
Yeah, look, I think the people do see prices, and unfortunately these sort of arguments become highly political before people can really get their head around it. And I think it depends who's got the best story, to be honest, how the public will actually feel about this. We're not talking about whether prices should come down. We're actually talking about what mechanism should be used. And all I would say is I think people are really quite distrustful at the moment, not only of big companies, but they're very distrustful of the government and all political parties and politicians. So anything that's actually talking about imposing control or price control, they would be saying, let's look at the consequences of that.
Peggy, do you have any thoughts on this? I don't imagine that any footy players have trouble paying their gas bill, given their wages, but your supporters obviously would. I mean, there's a huge number of people out there who are really struggling.
They are. I think that's sort of out of my expertise, but again, sort of like Michele says, you hear both sides. You don't know exactly where to come down if you're just a member of the public. So I think we need some more guidance and perhaps some more information about what's going on, because it seems to be masked in political talk these days.
Let's go back to our audience. We've got a question from Doug Killeen. Doug.
In a recent poll conducted by the Climate Institute, the question was asked, how important do you think it is that the government implement a clean energy target? And 77% agreed with that assessment. But this is only half of the question. The important question is, what are people prepared to pay to implement the target? In a recent US survey, Americans were asked what they were willing to pay to reduce emissions, and half were unwilling to pay even $1. And only 18% were willing to pay $100 a month. I'm not aware of any similar survey in Australia. Maybe we might hear about that. And I'm wondering whether the panel thinks that we'd get a similar result in Australia. And we've already talked about the rising prices of electricity.
Matt Canavan, we'll start with you.
Look, Doug, I can't quote the numbers off the top of my head, but I have seen similar polls in Australia saying, or coming to similar conclusions. Michele probably has more information at the tip of her fingers than myself. But look, I think we are in a situation where we've got to bring power prices down. We've seen 2 large coal-fired power stations go out of operation in the last 18 months, and wholesale power prices have doubled. A few years ago, there was a review done of the renewable energy target, which the modelling said we'd have wholesale power prices of $45 a megawatt hour right now. They're currently consistently running at 80, 90. In Queensland, they're $300 a megawatt over the weekend. This is putting at risk thousands of jobs in our country, and it is also meaning that lots of people who aren't of great means, particularly pensioners and older Australians, increasingly can't afford their power bills. We need to be focused on lowering prices. That's what people want. It's clear that the removal of those coal-fired power stations increase prices. It's clear to me that the solution is more supply of power, of reliable power, given the Greens and other parties' oppositions to gas production. We can't rely on gas. Renewables can't do it all the time. So we're left with coal, and that's what we've got to get.
Quick question for you, Matt. With the falling cost of renewables, there's debate over whether the clean energy targets should be maintained at all. Plenty on the government side would like to see it dropped altogether. What do you say?
Look, I just think we need to have a policy that focuses on lowering people's power bills, and then there is.
Will the clean energy target have an impact on the power bills?
The Finkel review has some economic modelling showing a moderate reduction in power prices, but I've got some queries about that myself. I think that the clear thing that has emerged in the last 18 months is a lack of supply. The market is far too tight. There's clearly a lot of gaming going on. In Queensland, it's 65% owned by government-owned corporations, and they were clearly gaming the market earlier in the year. As soon as the Queensland government directed them to stop that behaviour, wholesale power prices dropped by 25% in Queensland in 3 days. We've got to bring more supply into the market, and renewables just can't do that right now. Whatever they might happen in the future, right now, they do not work all the time. And if they were cheaper, well, people would be doing it already.
All right, Richard Natale and
So, Doug, you're absolutely right. People do support a clean energy target, but a clean energy target that supports coal isn't a clean energy target. So let's be clear about that. Let's just look at what's happened over the past few years. Since the Liberal government came in, slashed the carbon price, slashed the renewable energy target, must be said with the support of Labor, wholesale price of electricity's doubled. It's doubled. Since they've been in power, since they slashed the carbon price. When you get a bill, there needs to be a little photo of Matt Canavan and Malcolm Turnbull, just reminding you who's responsible for that. Now, the reality is...
We've heard that somewhere before, Richard.
Well, the government's own review has shown that when you've got more renewables in the system, you bring down the wholesale price of energy. The government's own internal review shows that. The good news is...
That review was wrong by a large margin.
It's your own review.
Yeah, that's right, and they were wrong.
Right, OK.
And the carbon, removing the carbon tax, I think
that says it all.
I'm an economist.
That says it all. We'll commission a review, we'll get an answer, we don't like it, we'll dismiss it.
Well,
look, the reality is, when you get more renewables in the system, you bring down the price of energy. And in fact, Josh Frydenberg just today said,
so how's that working for South Australia?
We don't need subsidies on renewable energy.
I'm just going to pause both of you politicians for a moment because our questioner has his hand up. We'll go back to Doug.
If you look at the data, it shows, and there's a very clear graph which has been published everywhere, that the higher the renewables in the mix, the higher the cost of electricity.
Spot on.
And South Australia has the highest mix of renewables and the highest cost of electricity anywhere in the world.
With respect, Doug, that's just not borne out by the facts. And the facts, in fact, demonstrate that the Warburton review, the government's own review, showed that when you've got more renewables in the system, you bring down the wholesale price of energy. Let me just finish.
No, but I'm just going to bring in Amanda because she's actually from South Australia and that's been raised.
Well, look, I just want to make the first point is that the government's Finkel review, which they commissioned, said that a clean energy target would not only reduce pollution but bring down prices. Why? Because at the moment, investment organisations, companies, don't know what technology to invest in because they don't know the rules of the game. And when you don't know the rules of the game, when 1 week you've got the government saying they're going to actually invest and put public money into coal-fired power station, the next week they say there's no point in a clean energy target because renewables are so cheap. How does any business know when to invest and what the rules of the game are? So a clean energy target is actually not about renewables. It is actually about getting more new technology that has low emissions into the system. That does exactly what Matt says, and that is increased supply. When it comes to renewable energy, there's a lot of talk about South Australia, but we've got to remember South Australia is connected to a national grid. And if there isn't enough power being made across the country, South Australia's at the end of it. So I would point out that, especially when people point to the storm, and that was a once-in-a-century storm, I'd invite anyone, I lived through that storm, I'd invite anyone to come and see the towers that were blown down. So it's a bit of a myth that the government's on. But if we want to push down energy prices and pollution at the same time, we have to welcome investment in low emissions technology because we also have to meet our Paris Agreement. And companies know that. Companies are calling for this. Consumers are calling for it. It's the time that we actually put this partisanship aside and actually got on with
Amanda,
the job.
just briefly on this, but one bipartisan thing that looked like was going to happen was agreement between the two major parties, at least, on the clean energy target. Does it sound to you like that target is under threat? Listening to Matt Canavan, there's a lot of concern about it.
Look, there's no doubt that it is under threat. Josh Frydenberg was clearly signalling today that it was under threat, and Matt Canavan and backbenchers within the Liberal Coalition Party have said it's under threat. But I will reiterate what Bill Shorten says. Malcolm Turnbull can sit down with Labor. We're willing to negotiate. We're not going to compromise. We want a system and a framework that will work into the future. But, you know, it's not our preferred option, but we will work with it if it means long-term certainty, which will increase supply and push prices down as well as pollution.
OK, once again, let's just see, Matt Canavan, there was a bipartisan option there to stick with a clean energy target and get Labor's support for it. Do you think that will happen? Do you think you'll stick with a clean energy target?
I'm not going to make predictions about those sort of things because they'll be matters that will be discussed among members of the Liberal National Party. But
it's in some danger, is it? That seems to be what you're suggesting.
It's something that it's a recommendation from a report, but of course,
your report.
Well, yes, but of course the government doesn't accept every. I mean, I used to write recommendations for reports. I mean, governments don't accept them all the time. That's fair enough. That's their prerogative, right? Reports are there to inform and guide.
But it sounds like it just sounds like you're preparing the populace for backtracking from the clean energy target.
No, it's not about populism. It's about getting people's power bills down. That's what we want to do, and that's what we've got to be focused on. So I don't really care what it's called, whether it's called a clean energy target or renewable energy target, or whatever it is. I want to do something that works for people, and that's what I'm questioning right now. Now, what is important? Amanda said she's willing to negotiate, but she's not willing to compromise. She's willing to negotiate, but the Labor Party will not even considering building the latest coal-fired power technologies, which reduce emissions, which produce a lot of power, which they're building 1,000 of these units in our region, which all of our... Yeah, because you guys have a ban on it, right? I mean, talk about, creating investment uncertainty, because the Labor Party, who used to be the party to support coal mining workers and manufacturing, today will not support using our own coal, which we export all around the world for other countries to use, but we're not allowed to use it here.
Okay,
that doesn't make a lot of sense to me.
Michele, where's the public on this, do you think?
Look, there's no question, and the point that you made earlier is absolutely right. The public is supportive of clean energy. The public is supportive of the environment. But when it comes to what they're willing to pay, They're not willing to pay. And this is what we've actually seen. We saw people really concerned about the environment. Come 2008, that concern dissipated because the issue became at what cost and who is going to pay. So it's all about price.
You're saying, we know where the future is. It's not in coal, it's in renewables. When Malcolm Turnbull said to AGL, we want you to keep open that dirty, polluting coal-fired power station for another few years, that thing that belongs in 1960s Russia, AGL said, nah, we don't want this thing. We're a renewable energy company. We want to build more solar, more wind, battery storage technology. That's where AGL see the future. That is where the investment community see the future. And it's politicians who are getting in the way. Elon Musk says to the South Australian government, I'll tell you what, we'll come over here and build batteries. If you politicians get out of the way, we'll build one of the biggest battery banks in the world. And they're on the way to doing it. This should be a good news story. We should be embracing it. It's what the rest of the world's doing, Richard, and yet we've got these dinosaurs who are holding us back.
There's 20 seconds done, more than 20 in fact. Remember, if you hear any... Thank you. Thank you very much. Now, remember, if you hear any doubtful claims on Q&A, let us know on Twitter. Keep an eye on the RMIT ABC Fact Check and the Conversation website for the results. Now, the next question comes from Molly Ashworth.
So, both Australia and the US have seen athletes and sporting clubs deliver political messages to their fans. We've seen NFL players take the knee during the national anthem in the US, and in Australia, AFL clubs have come out in support of marriage equality. Both actions have received high-profile condemnation, yet sport has an incredible number of supporters and athletes are role models. Considering this platform, shouldn't sporting figures not only have a right but a duty to deliver political messages?
Peggy O'Neill, that one's for you.
Well, I think you really can't separate sport and politics. I think because it is such a great platform and because sporting figures occupy a very prominent space around the world. And when you think about the Olympics, how more political can you be than what the Olympics stand for? I think that sport is often a social cohesive factor, and it brings people together and allows people to talk about issues that are otherwise maybe not addressed when we look at racism and sexism and inclusiveness and multiculturalism. So I think that we can't say our sporting figures are just sporting figures because other people have opinions and they do give voice to issues that are important to the community and sometimes bring the community together around a common purpose.
Now, you're obviously an American originally, at least. What do you think when Donald Trump came out and said he would, if it was up to him, he would sack the NFL players who took the knee in protest over police killings of young black men, or often young black men, in the United States during the national anthem?
Well, I think, one, I'm glad he's not the owner of all those teams, but I think it also shows that there's now solidarity among teammates, whether you're black or you're white or you're multicultural. And there are people from all walks of life who are taking the knee to show solidarity that you can't ignore the fact of our history, you can't ignore the fact of slavery, you can't ignore the fact of racism. So I think that it's now engendering a public debate on a very important topic, and Donald Trump is very divisive, as we know, but his actions allowed even more people to stand up and say, I'm with them.
Now, there were plenty of people in New South Wales who would have sacked those in the rugby league who made the decision to put Macklemore on to sing his same-sex anthem on the grand final. You had the big yes in the AFL grand final as well. I mean, what do you think about footy players and rugby league getting involved in that issue during a vote, during a national survey?
Well, I think if people say, I'm voting yes, then it's just showing support for what is at now the most topical debate other than energy, it appears. So I think that, again...
we'll get to that topical debate.
I had my picture taken it was on the front of the Fin Review holding the football saying yes. So I'm voting yes, and that was my opinion. So I think it's... Again, you can't really say to people, just because you're an athlete, you can't have an opinion. And I think it's important for them to be able to express that opinion, and that's part of the public debate.
Do you think that is the general opinion of your players?
Yes. Yes.
Michele, I'll come back to you on this. what's your view, and what's the public telling us again on this subject?
What's my view? My view is that we have freedom of speech, and footballers or cricketers or ballet dancers or anyone should be allowed to say what they think, and deal with consequences if people don't like that. But in terms of where the public is sitting on marriage equality, it's interesting. Had this just happened before there was any discussion, any plebiscite, any marketing on either side, it's clear from the Roy Morgan research that we would have had more than 80% of people supporting this issue. It was not sort of a very strong negative view at all. There was a small group of people who felt very strongly against marriage equality. As we look at it now, after the debate, the marketing and the issues that have been raised, our best estimate from asking people is that the vote will be yes. It will be about 60% or more that will actually support gay marriage, but it won't be in the 80%. There's been a big shift away.
Matt Canavan, we'll come back to that again, Michele, during the broader issue. But Matt Canavan, it was originally you started talking about sport, and what do you think about the involvement of sporting teams and codes in this, particularly in this debate?
I don't have any great problem with it, Tony. People, as others have said on the panel, they're free, organisations are free, and as the original question, I agree with Molly that sporting athletes and organisations certainly have the right to say what they like. I'm not quite sure, Molly, if they have a duty to say what they like. I think it's up to each individual, because I do agree with something Michele said too. I mean, if you're going to express a political view in a democracy, sometimes people will disagree with that view and may criticise that view. That's life, and obviously some people may want to avoid that. I mean, Israel Folau, a very good rugby, and he's been an AFL as well player, expressed support for traditional marriage and got heavily criticised, particularly on social media. But he seems to be water off his back. He's expressed his view. Good luck to him. We should all be able to express our views in a democracy, and debate's a wonderful thing.
Richard.
Well, I know Tony Abbott would have preferred Onward Christian Soldiers to Macklemore's Same Love, but the good news is lots more people got to hear it. Millions more people got to hear it. I'm with you, Molly. I reckon some of the most powerful moments are when sporting people stand up and take a stand. And I remember hearing the story about Peter Norman. He was the sprinter who in the 1968 Olympics joined with Tommy Smith and John Carlos, and they gave that really famous... there's a famous picture of them giving the Black Power salute and in support of civil rights. That was a really profound moment. When Muhammad Ali said, "I'm not going to fight in Vietnam," that was a profound moment. When Nicky Winmar was being taunted by racists at the football and lifted up his shirt and said, "I'm black and I'm proud of it," it changed the conversation. I remember seeing Cathy Freeman. I was lucky enough to win a ticket in the ballot for the 2000 Olympics and saw her do that victory lap with the Australian flag and the Aboriginal flag. They were moments of resistance. They were moments that helped shape the nation. And I think that when a sports person has a platform like that and uses it in that way, that's something we should be so proud of. And I've got to say also, as a Richmond supporter, Peggy is probably underselling the work that Richmond's doing in this area. Aboriginal leadership through the Kurrangamaji Institute, Bashar Hooli's Academy for young Muslim men. He's a multicultural ambassador.
And Muslim girls now too.
Sorry?
And Muslim girls.
And Muslim girls. And the work that the club's doing with the Women's Football League. There's so many things that are being done in that area that are positive, and using sport as a way of promoting those really important social values, I think, such a powerful thing, and we should encourage it.
Richard, I'm going to interrupt you just to go back to Molly, who has a hand up.
I suppose in response to what Mr. Canavan had to say about a duty, what I was trying to get at is in regards to the platform, considering that people who watch sport come from a variety of different backgrounds, it's a very unifying force in society. Considering you have that kind of platform and you are so admired, shouldn't you use that for good, irrespective of what side of the political spectrum you come from?
Let's hear from a Crows supporter.
Look, I absolutely agree with you, and one of the historical examples of that is how Nelson Mandela used the national rugby team to build the community together. But I was a little confused about what the uproar was, because it certainly came from government politicians, and they were the people that actually said, let's have a community discussion about this. And sport, whether they be the national sporting teams or our local sporting teams, are completely interwoven with our communities. So they are taking a lead in our communities, but they're also reflecting community values. And we ask, as government and as politicians, sport to do a lot of things. We actually ask them to do education on drug and alcohol. We ask them to hold white ribbon rounds and stand up against violence against women. So not just athletes, but actually sporting codes we ask to actually make social change and get out of their arena of their just sticking to their sport. So I think they play a really important role and will continue to do so. And I'm not sure what all the fuss was actually about.
Okay, we've got a...
Can I make a really important point? We're assuming that they're always going to say what we agree with.
Yeah.
And that's the real danger, isn't it? And it's a really big danger because what we're saying is we have freedom of speech. If these heroes had come out with the opposite view, I suspect the group here would feel very differently.
Well, that's the accountability part. And you have to remember that we think of Muhammad Ali now. He was a very divisive actor in the United States at the time, that he was an Olympic gold medalist. He decided he didn't want to go to Vietnam. He lost that. He went to prison. He came back and became what was then called Black Muslim. And what we think of now is this great civil rights leader, but he was someone who stood up at a time it wasn't popular and it made him very unpopular. So I think you're right. They don't always say what the majority of the community wants them to say.
But they are connected to community, that's my point. And they often do reflect community values because sporting clubs are not separate to community.
Amanda, you raised the question earlier about respect for women. We've got a question on that and the AFL from Laura Lafitte.
The Richmond Club and the AFL have adopted a respect and responsibility policy aimed at ensuring women are not objectified and treated poorly. But on Friday, there were reports of a photograph of a topless woman wearing a premiership medal being widely circulated by email and on blogs. We can only guess who took the photo and who sent it. But it would seem one of your players is involved. How does that represent respect and policy? And does the OC rules football have a problem with women?
Thank you.
I can't really comment on the particular event. I don't have all the facts about that. But if it turns out that it is disrespectful to women, we certainly don't stand for that. That's not what our club's about. And if someone has made a disrespectful and humiliating gesture, then of course it'll be taken into account. That isn't what we're about. That isn't what the AFL is about. I think that our club has shown it's for equality, it's for inclusiveness, and it wants to promote women. So the fact that someone has made a terrible judgment and maybe has been disrespectful, again, I don't know the particulars of what you're talking about, I think that doesn't say that's what the club's about or that's what sport's about, and people make errors in judgment all the time.
Is it serious enough to warrant an investigation?
I would expect that there's an investigation going on now. And like I said, I just am not across the facts because it's just been brought to my attention very recently within the last few hours, but I understand that something's going on. But I think the idea that respect and responsibility it started to make women feel welcome to come to games. And that's only a very low bar for women being involved in the game. And when you normalize the participation of women in all roles of all sports, then the likelihood of things like this happening are lessened. Because how women are treated around sport, because again, as we were saying, sport has such a pivotal part of our community, really says what we think about women overall. And so I think that sport also has the ability to make women regarded as more equal in the eyes of everyone. And so the respect and responsibility policy was the start. It hasn't been updated, it hasn't been modernized, and it hasn't been brought to the clubs in a way that's enforced. The clubs are much more strict on themselves than the AFL is with the respect and responsibility policy, and an update was promised almost 2 years ago, and we still don't have it. So I don't think that what looks like something that was could be humiliating that's happened with one player isn't what the entire AFL is about, and I think that's what sport's about. And I think as we see more and more women become involved in participation as well as leadership roles, things like that just won't happen.
OK, we've got a lot of questions to get through tonight. Let's move on. We've heard from Peggy on that. The next question is from Gordon Smith.
Mr. Canavan, I'm a young gay man who had the misfortune of attending an underprivileged public school. I endured slurs on a daily basis, was spat upon by more aggressive bullies, and found a countless number of notes stuffed into my locker, decrying me as bringing shame to my family, of being riddled with AIDS, and telling me that I was wasting my life. I was also told that I was a threat to children, and that being gay was no better than being a pedophile. Now you, Mr. Canavan, have criticised my community as being delicate little flowers who need to grow a spine in the face of abuse. Isn't the role of leadership to support society's most vulnerable, rather than kick them while they're down in hopes of a bit of conservative point scoring?
Matt Canavan.
Well, thank you for the question, Gordon. The comments that you are referring to, I made in reference to all sides of the debate. Indeed, the ABC reported my comments as criticising my fellow fellow no advocates who on that day were criticising some particularly vile tweets that were put out by someone on the yes side. I am very worried about the fact that we are struggling, I think, in modern democracy to respect other people's opinions. There is certainly a push from some, and some from very senior people. The Greens Party have regularly moved motions in the Senate calling those who have a view on traditional marriage or support traditional marriage as bigots, and by implication shouldn't be allowed to express that view. I think we should have and should be able to have a respectful debate on these issues, and sometimes they're sensitive, but I also think that living in a democracy means sometimes you're going to meet people and hear from people who you disagree with, and that can be frustrating and painful. Every time I turn on the ABC radio, I usually try to yell at the radio and about something they're saying, but that's democracy, and we get better debate, we come up with better decisions by having that. So when I'm saying I think there's delicate little flowers on both sides who can't seem to just be able to accept. Some people have a different view to you. That doesn't mean, I hope you don't know, I've contributed a lot to this debate, and I've tried to do so in a respectful way, but it's frustrating when others just seek to shut your view down just because you hold a particular view, not on anything you've specifically said.
Like you did to Westpac. When you said that Westpac shouldn't have spoken to their employees advocating for a yes vote.
I did not say that. No, that is not what I said. I said, well, they got
you called it same-sex blackmail.
No, I did not say same-sex blackmail. I did say that particular note was an attempt at blackmail because
that's the respectful debate that Matt Canavan wants.
Well, hang on, Richard.
That's the respectful debate you want.
That particular note you're referring to, they accused people who hold or support traditional marriage. They accused them of causing 3,000 suicides in Australia every year, when in fact last year there was only 2,800 suicides. They did so on no evidence whatsoever.
Yeah.
And accusing people, I think
you're not helping, Matt.
You're not helping.
I think Matt, the point there was, and what they were trying to convey is
they got the numbers wrong.
Yeah, but excuse me. I think the point they're trying to convey is that there is young people that are struggling with their sexuality and they don't feel included. That's obviously something that you felt, and that actually with saying yes to same-sex marriage could indeed, and there's evidence to show, could make them feel more included in society and their relations more equal. That's what they were trying to convey. And I think splitting hairs on the numbers is probably...
I'm sorry, Amanda.
...takes away from the seriousness of what there are many young people are facing.
Amanda, I think...
OK, hold on.
I think...
It's all very well. Sorry, it's all very well to applaud from time to time, but we do need to hear what's being said. Go ahead.
I think using the always tragic circumstances of individuals to try and win a political debate is blackmail.
That's the point. That's the whole point.
Hang on, Rich.
The whole point, Matt, is that people actually are hurt by a society that says they're not normal, they're not welcome. And as a doctor who saw young people struggling with their sexuality, but let's just hear from people. It harms them.
Hang on.
The reason we have higher rates of depression, anxiety, self-harm and suicide amongst young people who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, intersex or queer is because of a debate in a society that says you're not like us, you're different, you're abnormal.
Okay, all right,
now we need absolutely not what I have said, Richard. And let's just hear it clear from you. Do you accept my right and other people's right to have a view on marriage that's different from yours?
Let's hear it.
Matt, can I just interrupt there, Matt? No, just here's a point,
you
Matt.
might answer it.
I disagree with it, and I think you're profoundly wrong.
That's fine.
Matt, if you ask questions of the other panellists, they might give very long answers. So let me just give you the opportunity.
You tell that by experience.
Let me just give you the opportunity to respond, and then we'll hear from our questioner who had his hand up.
What is very concerning, I think, in this debate is that it is clear that lots of people that want to change the Marriage Act, and I fully respect someone having a view to do that. I understand that. There's some good arguments for it. But quite often you hear through the allegations that are made that support traditional marriage, something that's lasted thousands of years and it's still the case in 88% of countries around the world, that view should not even be allowed to be expressed. And what I'm very concerned about in the case of a yes vote is that there is no bill before the Parliament about what type of protections will be put in place to protect parents, to allow their children to be taught the version of marriage that they support in schools, to protect those of religious positions or other persuasions that want to have a different view. We don't know. In the case of a yes vote, there may be no protections put in place for those viewpoints. Indeed, the majority of proposals that have been put forward to the Parliament to change the Marriage Act have had none of those protections at all.
Okay, just hang on. I'm going to go back to our questioner. Gordon asked the original question. You've heard Matt Canavan's explanation of the comments that you say hurt you and people you know. Do you accept what he's saying?
Not really, no. I mean, we've lived in a democracy for more than 100 years. Why is this one debate, as you call it, which is about people's lives at the end of the day? Why does this need a different brand of democracy to any other law that we've ever passed?
Really good point.
Because in my view, Gordon, because of the evidence that Michele provided earlier, we've seen a situation where just having this debate has seen the support for marriage on Michele's figures drop by 20 points in the space of weeks. There clearly perhaps had not been, in my view, a detailed enough and strong enough debate before this point. Now, I give credit to Tony, you and the ABC during this debate, I think have been very welcoming to both sides. And it's the first time, for those of us that do have I have a traditional view of marriage, I have felt until these last few weeks, it's been very hard to express why I hold that view in the media. But we've had that opportunity and you've seen the polls change as much as they have, and I still think it's a very open result about what we'll actually get.
Okay, we've got a question from a completely different point of view. It's from Ilana Leeds. Ilana?
Okay. Those who want same-sex marriage say it's all about love and equality. And my question to the panel is, what about the right to love and equality of the children of same-sex unions? I think each child that is born into this existence has a right to the love and support and guidance of a mother and a father. And that is perhaps why my question to you is, how are people in same-sex unions going to provide that, both a mother and a father, because they're necessary?
It's got nothing to do with this debate. It's got absolutely nothing to do with this debate. People are already, if you're in a same-sex relationship, able to have children. So we've had that debate. That debate's been won already. What we're talking about now is the right of two people who love each other to get married. We're talking about having equality in a country that doesn't currently have it. So I know that people on the no side are trying to create a situation where if you think it's a bit cold today, vote no. If your footy team didn't win on the weekend, vote no. If you don't like political correctness, vote no. They'll want you to debate anything other than the substance, which is if two people love each other, why can't we allow them to marry each other? It's as simple as that.
Peggy, I haven't heard from you on this. You've seen the debate. You've expressed where you lie within the debate. But how do you feel about the debate as it's unfolding?
Well, I'm a bit disappointed that the politicians didn't go on and pass legislation because I think that that's their job. And I think the debate hurts people, it's unnecessary, and I think it's a move to populism that avoids people being elected to make these decisions for us. And I'm from the United States, and we have marriage equality, and that's one of the most conservative countries, and it just happened. And everything went ahead. As we know, many countries around the world have had it for decades now. The world hasn't stopped. Those countries and their economies and their families have still gone ahead. I think if you see it as more equality, not taking things away from people, but giving things to other people, I just don't see why it is so difficult and why we have to have a public debate on it when the politicians supposedly represent the public anyway.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you. We are going to have in a few weeks' time a complete Q&A devoted to this issue. We'll move on to some of the other issues we're facing at the moment. Hiba Abdel Hamid has a question.
My question is for the whole panel. In the context of the new anti-terror measures and the exceedingly complex and nuanced challenges that we're facing as a society, how can we better balance security and the right to privacy?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to start with Michele Levine here. Security and the right to privacy. There's been a long debate.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's shifting. As terror incidents are more frequent, the debate is shifting.
Yes, the debate is shifting. And you're absolutely right. It is all about trading off security and safety versus privacy or perhaps freedom. And when we at Roy Morgan surveyed that very fundamental values question about 30 years ago, Australians were all for freedom. And we didn't want security so much. We want both. Everyone wants both, but we would have chosen freedom. Today, when we put the question about the anti-terror measures where state governments will provide driver's licences so that you can have this, mass facial recognition technology and ask people are they concerned about it, only 1/3 of people are concerned. 2/3 say no. And a lot of it is actually because they're saying, one is the terrorism concern, which is elevated today compared to, say, 30 years ago. But secondly, our right to privacy is very different today. And in fact, one person said something like, well, Facebook has it already, why shouldn't the government or the police? Because Facebook are not going to protect us. So there's very different issues going on around privacy. It still is an issue of privacy, and those people who are concerned because they don't trust. I have to say, trust is one of the big issues. Do we trust the government? Do we trust that the information will be stored correctly? Do we trust that when terrorism is a thing of the past, this will stop? So there's not as much trust as you would actually need. And people are concerned about things like racial profiling. But overall, Australians are actually quite supportive of this. And I imagine it will just happen, and we won't even think about it again.
I'll just quickly go back to our question. Hiba, are you concerned about racial profiling?
I definitely would be in this case, and I think that in considering any kind of, I guess, keeping a balance, we do have to be aware of those nuances as well in terms of how we actually look at these really complex power dynamics that we apply as a society. So in the sense that, for example, we could be looking at, the anti-terror measures or whatever, but how can we make sure that they're not targeting specific kinds of people or specific communities? And in that sense, we are going back to human rights. How can we do that better? And that's what I'd really like to explore.
Okay, let's hear from this side of the panel. Richard, I know you have concerns, and Amanda, I'll hear from you straight after that.
Well, I think the big difference between Facebook and the government is that Facebook can't take a 10-year-old, round them up off the street, lock them up in a jail without charge for 2 weeks. That's what the government's proposing to do here. And as the parent of 2 young boys, I just think it's frightening that we would even consider allowing a government to take a 10-year-old off the street and lock them up in a jail for 2 weeks without charge.
Isn't that a different law?
Yeah, no, that's part of the suite of terrorism measures that we're talking about. Facial recognition.
From the privacy issue.
Well, let's talk about the facial recognition software and using the driver's licence. This government's made a mess of Medicare data. There have been Medicare data breaches. It's made a mess of Centrelink data. There have been serious breaches there. The AFP, a major breach when it came to data retention, breaking their own laws. I don't want to give governments, and having been up close and personal and seen this government, but all governments in action, I don't think we should be handing those power to governments.
Okay, Richard.
And that facial recognition software gets it wrong a lot of the time.
Richard, I'm going to go to Amanda. Now, Amanda, just on this issue,
Yes.
a whole bunch of Labor premiers just joined with the government, signed up to all of this. Does federal Labor agree with your state colleagues?
Well, look, I'd start by saying you're absolutely right. It's a very big tension, and you're right, there are real threats, but there are real, I guess, important protections we need to protect privacy as well. What the government has put forward in terms of the facial recognition is that if they are looking at CCTV footage and they have a suspect already identified, if they can't identify that person through passport photos, they will use licence photos to identify someone that is already a suspect in a serious crime. Now, on the face of it, that seems like, you know, a sensible extension of the measures. Where I would be really concerned is if that facial recognition software and I guess, capability was used to, for example, identify people at a peaceful protest. The devil is always in the detail, and that's why your question went to how do you ensure that this happens? Well, I believe I have a bit more trust than Richard in governments because I want to be part of a governing party,
You've got to be in opposition
let
first.
Me finish.
You have to be in opposition first.
I am being in opposition.
Labor has given everything to the government on this.
No, that is not true.
Richard,
let me finish
let her
talking.
finish.
Parliamentary scrutiny is really important. Now, we want to send this to the Intelligence Committee of the Parliament. So far, that committee has made 100 recommendations to ensure that the balance is right. And the government has admitted they got it wrong and have accepted those recommendations. So it's doing it not in a partisan way, but one that really acknowledges we have this tension. We have to get the balance right, and we must continually be vigilant and working on it through a collective process.
Now, Matt, yours.
Yeah, look, I'll be brief because Amanda has summed up the proposals quite well. The facial recognition technology would only be used in a CCTV context where there's a suspected criminal or criminal activity. I just wanted to clarify something Richard said. It has been the case before these proposals that a minor down to the age of 10 can be arrested. They can be held for 8 hours. After that, the court order is needed to hold them for 7 days. That's the existing arrangements and have been for some time, Richard. The proposal last week was to extend that for a further 7 days. A further court order would be needed at the end of 7 days to do that. It's in line with a change that the United Kingdom has made. And I think Michele summed it up well, that unfortunately the consequence of many of these attacks Western society is facing is that we have to strengthen laws. It's not something we'd like to do, but here we've got to protect people's life and safety, and more and more, it's very disturbing, but more and more, very young children are being co-opted to engage and support in some of these attacks on our society.
Okay, we're planning another big event soon, the second Q&A High School Special, live from Sydney on Monday the 6th of November. We're looking for senior high school students who are keen to tackle the big issues on the Q&A panel. So if you want to be considered, send us a 1-minute video audition. The details are on our website, but hurry, because entries close next Monday. Well, our next question comes from Kieran Simpson.
Thank you. My question is to Matt Canavan. Should the High Court rule on your citizenship issues in your favour and you return to your role as Resource Minister with the NAIF, will you continue to advocate to loan Adani $1 billion of taxpayers' money? Despite all the evidence that proves that the Carmichael coal mine is economically unviable, that Adani will deliberately attempt to not pay any tax, will seek to automate all the jobs away, and will leave a devastating wake of environmental destruction.
Thank you, Kieran, for the question. I don't support many of the premises in it, of course. I'm not the Resources Minister at the moment, but I continue to advocate the opening up of the Galilee Basin, and I do so because it would be the first coal basin to open up in Australia for nearly 50 years. There are 6 potential mines there, and according to the Queensland Government Coordinator General, up to 15,000 direct jobs in mining would be created by that opening up the Galilee Basin. I support it because the traditional owners of the land support the development. They voted last year 293 to 1 in favour of the mine, 293 to 1. And if we are going to respect as a country, the rights of traditional owners under the Native Title Act. I think we should actually support their positions. We can all have our different views, but that's what they want. The communities of North Queensland support this development because of unemployment is very high and above the national average in my town of Rockhampton and in Townsville further north. We need to have projects like this to open up the country.
Matt, the questioner asks specifically, if you became Resource Minister again, would you support the $1 billion loan to Adani?
Look, I've said before, and my position wouldn't change, that is a matter for the Northern Australian Infrastructure Facility. They're an independent body that would have to assess that project. I don't see a fundamental issue, I've said before, with governments investing in infrastructure. The Labor Party under Kevin Rudd invested more than $1 billion in the Hunter Valley coal network in 2008. It's been a very worthwhile investment. It's paid off considerably, massively expanded the Newcastle port.
So just to confirm, you would still support the $1 billion loan?
No, that's not what I said, Tony. What I said is...
Well, you're arguing in favour of large loans.
Well, I support investments in infrastructure. That's why we set up the $5 billion Northern Australian Infrastructure Facility. The specific investments under that facility have to be assessed by the NAIF first before I take a position.
OK, Richard Di Natale?
Well, it's going to be no surprise given the T-shirt I'm wearing, but look, the reality is if this mine goes ahead, we lose a Great Barrier Reef, we lose the 70,000 jobs that depend on it. We've just seen extreme weather battering America and the Caribbean, 6 hurricanes over the last month or so. We've had bushfires in Sydney a couple of weeks, or in New South Wales a couple of weeks out of winter, record after record being broken. This mine can't go ahead. It just can't go ahead. And certainly with Adani, a company that has left a toxic environmental legacy wherever it's gone. It is a multinational tax dodger on steroids. This is a company that will only be able to build this mine if it gets support from all of you. All of you will be paying for this through your taxes because the government wants to throw $1 billion at it. It can't find finances anywhere in the world. And in fact, Matt Canavan went so far as to criticise Westpac for saying they wouldn't finance it. Look, we could stop it. We could stop it tomorrow. What we need Bill Shorten to come out and say he'll review the environmental approvals. If Labor's elected, the mine will be dead because no one will invest in it with that uncertainty.
Let's ask Amanda. It's a difficult issue for Labor because the Queensland Labor government supports the mine.
Well, look, your point about it economically stacking up, Labor's been very, very clear that we don't see taxpayers' money should be invested in this mine. There's the Northern Australia Infrastructure Fund that hasn't spent a cent, and there are many projects that it could spend money on to develop jobs in Northern Australia. But in terms of what we've said is we believe it needs to both environmentally and economically stack up. There are strict laws in Australia about environmental protections, and they need to not only be achieved in the approval but complied with. And if this project does go ahead, you would expect that both state and federal governments would look very, very closely at that. But in terms of the economics, we've been very, very clear that we don't think taxpayers' funds should be going to propping up this project.
Amanda, very briefly, the Four Corners program raised a whole series of serious allegations about what Adani has been doing in India. Did that not sway Labor's view?
Well, look, as I said, there are very, very clear environmental laws here in Australia, and I wouldn't want any approval of this mine, if it's to go ahead, to be just a tick and flick exercise. It needs to comply with those strict environmental laws. When it comes to multinational tax avoidance, there are a number of companies doing that in this country, and we want to see those loopholes shut down. And when it comes to economically stacking up, well, that is a question for the mine, but certainly, as I said, we don't support taxpayers' money going into this project.
All right, we've got time for one last question. We have our own restrictions on time. This one's from Lucy Walk.
Thank you. This one's to Peggy O'Neill. In Australia, our most well-known female CEOs tend to be foreign-born, so Gail Kelly at Westpac, Jane Herdlicker at Jetstar, Cindy Hook at Deloitte, and even Peggy O'Neill of Richmond. Do you think that being a foreigner allows you to bypass some of the unconscious gender biases that women might otherwise encounter in corporate Australia?
Peggy.
You've named a number of foreign-born women, but I think there are probably more Australian-born women in those roles that you didn't name. I don't think that there was anything special about where I was born as to, I just found something I loved doing and just followed that. I loved sport. I loved going to the football. And when I moved to Australia, I moved to Richmond. And so I picked Richmond and I walked down to the MCG. I still live in Richmond. So I just followed something that I loved. The unconscious bias is everywhere. I don't think that it's anything that's unique to Australia, and people call it unconscious bias sometimes, and sometimes it's just discrimination. So I'm not sure that where you're born makes any difference, but if all of us have found a pathway to follow something that we love, and I'm not the CEO, I'm just sort of chairman of the board, then I think it shows that Australia is still quite open to people from other places coming and finding a role here and making a meaningful contribution to society.
We've got a lot of questions, Peggy, about how a woman could make it in this male-dominated AFL world.
Mm-hmm.
How'd you manage that? I mean, that's a feat that very few have accomplished.
Well,
very few women, anyway.
Well, I was a partner in a big law firm, and I think law prepared me well for sport. There aren't any women in law either at very senior levels. And so maybe I got a little bit immune to being the only woman in the room. And again, I just found something that I liked and I kept doing. I think it says a lot about Richmond that it didn't matter if they thought you could do the job and you could contribute and you were willing to do it, that they gave me a chance. And then there was some support. But I think also that lots of times people think they solve the women problem by just picking a woman and dumping her into something. And you really have to have support and cultural change. And I've often said that when you're the only woman in the world, you're all the women in the world. I mean, only women in the room, you're all the women in the world. And that means that other women get a chance depending on how you act. And we've all heard, oh, we tried a woman once, that didn't work out, so we aren't getting another one. And so you really need some critical mass. You need more women, and that's normalizing and not saying that we have a spot for a woman. I think more and more as you go to skills-based boards and qualifications, you realize that the skills aren't gender specific. The skills are just open to anyone. And again, I just found something I loved and I kept following it.
Did you feel any sympathy for Julie Bishop this week when she was talking about what it was like to be the one woman in Tony Abbott's cabinet?
Yeah.
And actually, even later in Malcolm Turnbull's cabinet, to bond with the other women in cabinet and support each other unconditionally because they didn't believe the men would.
I saw those comments and they did sort of strike a chord. And in fact, I keep a list of all the women who are on AFL club boards. There are 37 of us now across the 18 clubs. And we get together and have dinner a couple of times a year. And again, it's that supportive kind of environment where you have a peer group. And there's some people who are in sporting industries, like women who are now coaches, who don't have a peer group. So we're trying to include them as well. So I think it's very important to have somebody who understands what you're going through and somebody who can support.
The things from those dinners that you have, are there a whole raft of things that you wouldn't share with the public?
Well, most of it we talk about football, believe it or not. And then we talk about boring things like finance and governance and those kinds of things. But there's always a few war stories about, can you believe what's still going on? So, no, they're very collegiate. And in fact, we're having one this week, postseason.
Well, I'd like to be a fly on the wall, Peggy. It's not going to happen. That is all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel. Amanda Rishworth, Richard Di Natale, Peggy O'Neill, Matt Canavan and Michele Levine. Thank you very much. Now, remember, you can continue the discussion on Q&A Extra with Tracy Holmes and Professor Jackie Ramage of Sydney University. They're taking comments on ABC News Radio and Facebook Live as soon as we finish. Next week on Q&A, rock and roll author Jimmy Barnes, Victorian National Senator Bridget McKenzie, West Australian Labor MP Anne Alley, and the former Deputy Prime Minister Tim Fischer. Until next Monday, good night.
Still got something to say?